The galactic empire's reach was vast, stretching across galaxies, systems, and countless worlds. A machine of unimaginable power, the empire's influence was built on the suffering of others, planets stripped of resources, populations conquered, and cultures crushed under the weight of its demands. For centuries, they had ruled unchallenged, and their methods were simple: demand tribute, enforce compliance, and crush any opposition without mercy. The representatives of the empire were never questioned. Their words were law. No species had ever dared to refuse the tribute demands, and those who had tried were wiped from existence without a trace. The empire's fleet, a force of technologically superior ships, hovered in the depths of space, ready to show the Earth what true power was. Earth had been a curiosity to the empire for some time. The humans were a primitive species compared to the galactic civilizations, yet they had shown enough potential to warrant attention. Their technology was still in its infancy, their societies fractured and divided, but there was something about them that intrigued the empire. For all their primitive tools, humans had managed to survive on a hostile world, survive wars of their own making, and more impressively, they had begun exploring the stars. Though far from a galactic power, humanity's potential was undeniable. They were an enigma, one the empire couldn't afford to ignore. A fleet of imperial warships, each massive enough to decimate entire cities, made its way toward Earth's orbit. Commander Threx, the representative of the empire, stood at the helm of the flagship, a towering vessel covered in obsidian-like armor. He was a man of purpose, a man who had crushed countless rebellions and broken countless spirits. His reputation was unmatched, and his confidence was unshakable. He had no doubt that Earth would bow to the empire, just as every other species had. As the fleet neared Earth, a transmission was sent to the planet. The message was standard, efficient, and cold. The people of Earth would be required to send tribute, raw materials, scientific knowledge, and a select number of individuals to be taken for research purposes. The message was clear. The empire demanded its due, and failure to comply would be met with swift and brutal consequences. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of defiance. Commander Threx awaited the inevitable response. It was a formality, a step in the process, a moment where Earth's leaders would express their fear and compliance. He had seen it happen hundreds of times. The request would be accepted, and the tribute would be delivered. Earth would become just another conquered world in the Empire's ever-expanding domain. But something was different this time. The leaders of Earth, meeting in a secure underground chamber, exchanged uneasy glances. They were frightened. The technology displayed in the Empire's ships was far beyond anything humanity had ever seen. The power of the Imperial fleet was beyond comprehension. Any resistance, no matter how well organized, would be meaningless. The human race was small and insignificant in the face of such power. Yet, despite the fear, they knew they could not surrender their dignity. "Do we just give them everything they want?" one of the leaders asked, his voice trembling. "Do we really have a choice?" Another replied, his voice tight with anxiety. "They have the power to wipe us out with a thought. How can we possibly refuse?" Yet amidst the panic and the uncertainty, one human spoke with calm conviction. It was Ambassador Alia Mitchell, a seasoned diplomat who had seen her share of international crises, but had never faced anything like this. She knew the stakes were high, but she also understood one thing: Earth had a way of surviving against all odds. "This isn't just about resources or technology," Alia said, her voice steady. "This is about our sovereignty. We are not a colony to be plundered. If we give in now, we'll never regain control." The room fell silent. Some of the leaders were uncomfortable with her stance, while others were emboldened. Alia wasn't naive. She understood the consequences of defying the Empire, but she also understood that humanity had a resilience that could not be easily extinguished. "There's no way we can defeat them with force," another leader pointed out. "We can't even begin to fight back against their ships." Alia nodded, acknowledging the truth of the statement. The Empire's power was immense, but what they didn't understand was the one thing that could never be measured by firepower or technology: Humanity's greatest strength wasn't in their weapons, it was in their unpredictability, their refusal to accept defeat, and their ability to find strength in the most unlikely places. I don't know how we'll do it, Alia continued, but we have to make them understand that we won't be treated like this. We won't be their slaves. Our response has to be one that shows them we are not afraid. The group was divided. Some feared retaliation. Some wanted to comply to avoid conflict. But in the end, a decision was made. It wasn't a military strategy or a scientific breakthrough. It was something simpler, something more profound. They decided that humanity's response to the Empire's demands would be simple, direct, and defiant. Alia opened the communication channel. Her face appeared on screens across the Empire's flagship, and Commander Threx watched as she spoke. She didn't waste words, didn't beg or plead. She didn't even threaten. She simply said one word. No. The silence that followed was deafening. Commander Threx blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. It was absurd. No species in the history of the Empire had dared to refuse tribute. No one had ever stood in defiance. The audacity, the sheer audacity of it was beyond comprehension. Earth had just rejected the might of the Empire with a single word. It was a moment that should have been inconceivable, but there it was, staring him in the face. For a long moment, Threx did nothing. He was too stunned to respond, his mind racing to process what had just happened. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not now, not ever. His reputation was at stake. The power of the Empire was at stake. He couldn't let this defiance go unanswered. But no response came. No orders, no retaliation, just silence. He was still processing the audacity of the humans when his communication officer interrupted his thoughts. Commander, they've cut the transmission, the officer reported. Threx clenched his fists. The humans had rejected them. Rejected the Empire. In the face of overwhelming power, they had chosen to resist. And the Empire didn't know how to handle that. The transmission from the Empire's flagship was clear and direct. Commander Threx's voice, crisp and authoritative, filled every communication channel across the planet. It was a declaration, not a request, and humanity was about to learn the true meaning of galactic dominance. We, the Galactic Empire, have watched you, Earth. Threx's voice boomed through the speakers worldwide, his words amplified by the full force of the Empire's might. Your species has proven itself capable of minor technological achievements. You have survived among the stars, but your time has come. You will now comply with the tribute demanded of all civilizations under the Empire's protection. You will send your finest resources, your greatest minds, and representatives of your species. Failure to comply will result in immediate annihilation. You have 30 Earth rotations to respond. The message echoed across the globe. Governments scrambled, leaders debated, and the world held its breath. It wasn't the first time a threat had been made against Earth, but this was different. This was no rogue faction, no isolated warlord. It was the Empire, a colossus that had swallowed entire star systems without hesitation. Earth was nothing compared to the galactic behemoth that now loomed above them. In the days that followed, panic set in. The world's major governments, leaders, and military forces convened. The United Nations, NATO, and other coalitions came together in an emergency summit. Scientists, economists, and diplomats were summoned to discuss the threat and, more importantly, the impossible choices before them. The planet was divided. Half wanted to comply and offer whatever the Empire demanded to ensure survival, while others, the more idealistic and rebellious, argued that humanity should fight back, even if it meant certain death. But as the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. Human ingenuity, a core trait of the species, rose to the surface. Scientists and engineers quickly realized that Earth's technology, though primitive compared to the Empire, could still be used to resist in some small way. Plans were drawn up, satellites hacked, and old military archives scoured for ideas that might, just might, slow down the Empire's vast fleet. Yet, even the most optimistic minds knew the truth: Earth was outmatched. Then, in a tense meeting of world leaders, as generals and diplomats bickered over what to do, something else occurred. In the midst of all the strategic debates, one voice broke through the cacophony. It wasn't a politician, nor a military commander, but a single individual, a low-ranking ambassador who had spent years as a liaison between Earth and lesser intergalactic species. His name was Michael Caine. Caine was no hero. He wasn't a scientist or a general, and he didn't have the charisma of a president or the authority of a military officer. He was just a man who had worked in the diplomatic trenches, often forgotten, but always observant. And it was Caine who, in the midst of all the fear, uncertainty, and grand plans, said something that no one else had the courage to say. No. The room fell silent. It wasn't a word that should have been spoken in this context. The Empire's message was clear: comply or perish. Yet Caine's refusal was both shocking and electric. His calm, steady voice stood in stark contrast to the panic of the room. At first, no one knew how to respond. Some dismissed it as madness, others thought it was a misplaced joke. But Caine's conviction in his simplicity sent a ripple through the room. He stood firm, unshaken, despite the mounting tension in the air. The rest of the leaders looked to one another, unsure whether to follow his lead or call for an emergency retreat to avoid a swift destruction. After what felt like hours, they finally made a decision. Earth would not bow to the Empire. Not yet. Caine's single word, "No," reverberated through the media, across all channels, and in every corner of Earth. It wasn't just a rejection, it was an assertion. An act of defiance that spread like wildfire. People took to the streets, not in fear, but in resolve. Rallies erupted in cities all over the world. "No" became the rallying cry of a united species. Suddenly, humanity was no longer divided by political ideologies or military strategy. They were united in one singular purpose. They would not bow to a conqueror. Meanwhile, Commander Threx, on the Empire's flagship, sat in disbelief. He had expected fear. He had expected panic. But no? How could they resist? Earth was nothing. Just a speck in the vastness of the Empire's domain. What kind of species would reject the chance for protection, for survival? No species in the Empire's history had ever acted so irrationally. There had to be a misunderstanding, a glitch in the transmission, some kind of error. Threx's fingers hovered over the command console, his mind racing. Perhaps it was a trick. Perhaps it was an act of desperation. But no, it wasn't desperation. It was defiance. And Threx could not fathom the possibility that Earth would dare stand against the might of the Empire. He turned to his officers, demanding an immediate response. More transmissions were sent, each one more forceful than the last, and each one met with the same simple, shocking answer. No. The Empire had never encountered such resistance. And in their shock, they failed to see the real danger lurking in the humans' answer. Defiance was only the first step. What followed would not be what they expected. As the deadline drew closer, humanity stood on the precipice of submission. Every nation, every leader, was faced with the same question: what to offer the Empire? Some pushed for resources, gold, rare metals, the fruits of Earth's natural wealth. Others, more strategically inclined, suggested sending the Empire what they thought the aliens truly wanted: scientists, engineers, even people to serve as proof of human submission. But a loud voice rose above the rest, echoing through global forums and broadcasts, the voice of resistance. A grassroots movement, small at first, had been growing in response to the Empire's demands. Led by common citizens, rogue thinkers, and a handful of defiant world leaders, the movement argued that submission was not the answer. The rhetoric was simple yet radical. "We are humans, and we will not kneel." In underground circles and social media forums, the movement spread like wildfire. People who had never thought of resistance now rallied behind the banner of defiance. The Empire had expected fear, but instead, they faced a growing chorus of rebellion. Citizens began speaking out openly. "We are not their cattle," they said. "We are not their property to trade or sell." It was a sentiment that united the masses in a way no government, no military force, had ever managed to. As the deadline approached, Commander Threx prepared for the inevitable. The Empire was certain Earth would submit. After all, every other species had. But then, on the eve of the Empire's ultimatum, Earth's response came. It wasn't a missile, nor a fleet of ships. It wasn't a bomb or a nuclear threat. The response came in a single word. It was short, direct, and pointed. No. It wasn't a declaration of surrender or a plea for mercy. It wasn't a bargaining chip or a half-hearted offer of negotiation. It was a statement of defiance, the kind that echoed across history whenever the oppressed stood against the powerful. The word was transmitted across all channels, everywhere, to every corner of Earth. The message was clear, concise, and unambiguous. No. It was not a plea for peace. It was a challenge. A challenge that shook the core of the Empire's power. Commander Threx, watching from the command center, was momentarily stunned. This was a species that had been subjugated for millennia. This was a species that had just begun to grasp the rudimentary concepts of interstellar exploration. And yet they had refused. At first, the Empire's reaction was disbelief. The idea of resistance was absurd. A tiny, insignificant planet, with no means to defend itself, defied the most powerful military force in the galaxy. It was laughable. But as the hours passed, something else began to stir. The Emperor's advisors were equally baffled. They expected the humans to beg for mercy or offer up vast sums of wealth. They had expected compliance. But in their response, the humans had shown something far more dangerous, something the Empire could not calculate. A defiance born of pride. A refusal to be dominated. It was an expression of humanity's deepest instinct, survival, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Back on Earth, the word, no, was not just a political statement, it was a rallying cry. Across cities and nations, people who had been caught up in the fear of impending doom now stood firm. The human race had made its choice, and it wasn't submission. It was resistance. The movement's leaders, once underground and silenced, were now celebrated as heroes. Public speeches, rallies, and broadcasts filled the airwaves with a new message: humanity would fight for its right to exist. For the first time in history, Earth was united, not by fear, but by defiance. And the Empire? They watched as their reputation, their invincible might, began to crack under the weight of a single word. The Empire had never encountered such resistance. Even when lesser species had tried to resist, they had always been crushed under the Empire's boot. But the humans weren't afraid. The idea that a species could defy the Empire, even knowing that retaliation was imminent, was anathema to everything the Empire had built. They thought of their own dominance, their centuries of unchallenged authority, and then looked to the humans, who had so easily brushed aside their threats. The Empire was at a crossroads. Commander Threx, though still confident, felt the first stirrings of doubt. He ordered an immediate response, but there was no immediate action. No threat of bombs or fire. Instead, the Empire chose to observe. They had underestimated humanity once before, and now they were unsure how to proceed. Would Earth break under the pressure of the Empire's force? Or had they truly woken something within humanity that would make them a far more formidable adversary than the Empire had ever anticipated? On Earth, people watched, breathless, as the Empire stalled. Commander Threx's confidence was slipping. But there was no way the Empire could let this go unpunished, right? The question gnawed at the back of every leader's mind. Had Earth, in its defiance, truly made the right choice? Would humanity's refusal turn into victory, or was it the last act of a doomed species? Only time would tell. The Empire, for all its power, was stunned into silence. It was a response they hadn't anticipated. A single word, simple, concise, and utterly defiant. Earth hadn't begged for mercy, hadn't cowered at the sight of their armada. They had rejected the Empire, flatly and without hesitation. The implications were far-reaching, and for a moment, even the vast might of the Galactic Empire paused. Commander Threx sat at his command table, staring at the transmission he had just received. The word, no, glared back at him, bold and unyielding. He couldn't fathom it. No species had ever turned down the Empire's demands. The power of the Empire was not just in its fleets but in its reputation, unquestioned, absolute. Yet here was a species that had dared to defy it. For the first time, the Empire hesitated. There was no immediate retaliation, no instant strike. Instead, they analyzed the situation, as if searching for some deeper meaning in the response. Could it be a mistake? A malfunction? A defiant fool speaking for the whole of humanity? Surely not. The Empire's command was absolute, its methods flawless. Yet here was Earth, weak, divided, technologically inferior, and they had dared to say no. But what followed next was beyond the Empire's comprehension. Earth didn't back down. They didn't apologize or plead for mercy. They stood firm, and, as the weeks wore on, they began to show the Empire something that hadn't been considered: creativity, innovation, and an unyielding will to survive. Earth's response to the Empire was not merely a rejection. It was a revelation. Humans, with their limited resources and primitive technology, had begun to work together in ways the Empire never anticipated. Within days, Earth's brightest minds, scientists, engineers, and military leaders, came together to form a unified front. They began developing countermeasures, not through brute force, but through ingenuity. Earth's greatest strength had always been its ability to adapt, to improvise, and to find solutions where none existed. The first sign that Earth was not just defying the Empire but preparing for something greater came when their communication systems were updated. The Earth defense networks, previously incapable of defending against the Empire's might, had been restructured, fortified with technologies that had once been the stuff of science fiction. It was a patchwork, of course, rushed and imperfect, but it worked. Earth began to broadcast countersignals, jamming the Empire's transmissions, scattering the Empire's surveillance with clever digital subterfuge. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. And then came the first strike. Not a physical weapon, but a psychological one. Using their newly fortified communications, Earth broadcast a message to the Empire, one that would be heard across the galaxy. It was short, direct, and carried the same defiant energy as their first response. You want a tribute? We will give you something far greater. Humanity will not kneel. The Empire, still reeling from the audacity of Earth's refusal, began to see what they had truly underestimated. The human spirit wasn't just stubborn, it was contagious. Everywhere, on every continent, the call for unity spread. Earth's greatest leaders, those once too afraid to take a stand, now found themselves emboldened. From the farthest reaches of the world, from the underground movements to the highest government offices, humans began to prepare. There were no armies large enough to challenge the Empire's fleet head-on, but they would not be defeated in a conventional way. The battle for Earth would be fought differently. What had started as a single word, a defiant refusal, transformed into a rallying cry that reached every corner of the Earth. And the Empire, with all its technological might and galactic dominance, suddenly found itself on the receiving end of something they had never faced: human determination. Earth was no longer just a planet to be exploited, it was a symbol of resistance, and that made the Empire's presence increasingly uncomfortable. By the time Commander Threx realized the gravity of the situation, it was too late. Earth had evolved from an insignificant planet in the Empire's eyes to a formidable adversary in ways no one could have predicted. The human race had taken a stand, not just for survival, but for their very identity. And in doing so, they had shown the galaxy that even the mightiest empire could be defied with a single word. The Empire had underestimated humanity's greatest strength, its unwillingness to submit. And that, in the end, would be their undoing.